The wind of late autumn swept across the Montana plains with a sharpness that carried both danger and promise, as if the land itself whispered secrets only the brave could endure. On that restless afternoon, a young woman named Clara Edison stood at the edge of Callahan Ranch, her worn carpetbag pressed close against her side, her pride and resilience her only shield. The year was 1878, and the world had already demanded too much from her. Yet here she was, seeking another chance beneath skies that seemed endless and mountains that loomed like ancient guardians. Her boots sank into the cold soil, each step a prayer that she might finally find a place to belong, a place where whispers of her past could no longer hunt her down. Men lingered near the barn, leaning against wooden beams, their eyes carrying the weight of curiosity, mischief, and judgment. Clara felt their gazes burn her skin, but she refused to falter. Her voice remained steady, though her stomach ached with hunger and her bones trembled with exhaustion. She had skills, cooking, mending, healing herbs, even reading and writing, words that sounded fragile against the rough laughter of cowboys, yet were strong enough to carve her a place in this untamed world. A bargain was struck. $2 a week, meals, and a room no larger than a closet. It wasn't much, but it was survival. As she stepped toward the main house, dust clinging to the hem of her dress, her eyes caught on a solitary figure at the corral. He didn't join the others in their smirks or low whistles. Instead, he moved with quiet concentration, calming a nervous mare with a patience that spoke of wounds not easily seen. When he finally looked up, their eyes met. His were grey, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, and for the briefest heartbeat, something unspoken passed between them. Then he turned back to his work, as if nothing had happened. But Clara knew. She felt it in the quiet trembling of her heart. This was no ordinary man. This was Jack Roosevelt. The kitchen was chaos, pots crusted with grease, soot thick on the stove, mouse droppings like punctuation marks of despair. Yet Clara rolled up her sleeves, determined to transform this wreck into something livable, something human. The smell of stew soon filled the air, bread baked golden, and the men who filed in for supper that evening were stunned into silence. Some looked at her with crude hunger, others with reluctant respect. And at the far end of the table sat Jack, who did not gawk, did not jeer, but simply watched her with a quiet gravity that unsettled and soothed her at once. Later that night, when she thought herself alone, a knock came at her door. Jack stood there, offering blankets against the cold. He asked for nothing, expected nothing, only placed them gently in her arms with the words, "Everyone deserves a warm bed and a fresh start." The scent of leather and cedar lingered on the cloth, and Clara lay awake long into the night, not because she feared, but because for the first time in years she felt something close to safety. In the days that followed, whispers chased her through the ranch like restless spirits. Some men muttered that she was too pretty for kitchen work. Others tested her resolve with crude jokes. But Clara faced them all with the steel she'd forged through hardship. And whenever she faltered, Jack's presence anchored her. He fixed loose boards, offered quiet kindness, and carried with him a mystery she longed to unravel. There was something about the way he watched her, not like a possession to be claimed, but like a truth waiting to be spoken. One afternoon, reaching for supplies, disaster struck. A chair tipped, a crate collapsed, flour exploded like snowfall, and Clara tumbled to the ground. Her dress tore open, bearing more than any decent woman should show. And of course it was Jack who walked in at that very moment. His hands shook as he covered her shoulders with his coat, his jaw clenched with restraint. His voice roughened when he asked if she was hurt. It was her pride that stung most, but beneath the humiliation she felt something else, a strange stirring that frightened her as much as it healed her weary soul. Already the battle lines were forming. Vince Morgan's mocking words, Jack's quiet defense, Morse's watchful judgment. Clara knew the past had a way of chasing her, and soon the truth she'd buried would come clawing to the surface. Yet she also knew something else. This land, this ranch, this quiet man with storm-grey eyes might just be the place where her story changed, where the girl who had been broken and scorned could finally breathe, love, and rise again. And as she scrubbed the last of the flour from her hair, clutching Jack's coat close to her, she whispered into the empty night, "Don't let me fail here. Don't let me lose this chance, for even in the harshest winds of Montana, hope can take." If these words touched your heart, if you felt the stirrings of warmth and healing in Clara's journey, I gently invite you to leave a like, share a comment about what moved you, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this love story. Every bit of your support is a light that helps me bring more of these tender, timeless tales to life. And now, with the night deepening and the story just beginning, Clara's path leads toward the moment when shadows of her past will rise again, testing the fragile thread of trust she has begun to weave with Jack Roosevelt. The first light of morning poured through the thin curtains of the storage room, pale gold spilling across the floorboards like a gentle promise. Clara stirred awake, the blankets Jack had given her still wrapped around her shoulders, carrying that faint scent of leather and sage that brought her a strange, quiet comfort. For the first time in months, she had slept without fear. No drunken laughter outside her door, no footsteps creeping closer, no whispers that stripped her dignity. Only the steady hum of a ranch awakening, horses whickering, men calling to one another, the smell of coffee drifting through the air. It was a small kind of healing, but it was enough to let her heart remember what peace could feel like. By the time she stoked the fire in the kitchen, the men were already stumbling in, yawning, rubbing their eyes. She moved with a practiced rhythm. Coffee poured dark and steaming, flapjacks flipping on the griddle, bacon crisping to perfection. She found herself humming softly, a tune from her childhood that rose like sunlight through the shadows of memory. Old Theodore Sherman, his hands twisted with age and work, gave her a smile that crinkled the corners of his weathered eyes. "You're trying to spoil us, Miss Edison," he teased, and Clara returned his smile with warmth. For the first time she felt the thread of belonging stretch across the room, but beneath the easy laughter of men, danger always lurked. Vince Morgan leaned against the wall, watching her every movement with that grin that was more a sneer. His words slithered close. "Pretty hands for kitchen work." Clara ignored him, her back straight, her head high. She'd learned long ago that acknowledging men like him only gave them more power. And yet, in the corner of her eye, she saw Jack watching too. Not with Vince's hunger, but with something steadier, something that felt like safety. When she passed by with the coffee pot, he lifted his hand to stop her. "I can serve myself," he said gently, his voice low enough that the others could not twist it. "You've done more than enough." His grey eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat the kitchen seemed to still, the noise fading into a softer world where only they existed. It became a pattern over the days that followed. She worked from dawn until nightfall, her body aching, yet every small act, kneading bread, stirring stew, mending shirts, was a step toward reclaiming herself. Jack was never far, always close enough that she could feel his presence, never overstepping, never demanding. He fixed a broken latch, repaired a window that stuck, carried water buckets when they were too heavy for her arms. Sometimes their hands brushed, and the spark of that touch lingered longer than it should, like a hidden ember waiting to grow. One afternoon she climbed on a crate in the pantry to reach a sack of flour, stubborn pride pushing her higher than sense should allow. The wood groaned, shifted, and suddenly the world tilted. Clara fell with a cry, flour bursting in a white cloud around her as her dress tore down the side. Shocked breath rushed from her lungs, humiliation burning her cheeks. And in that moment, Jack burst through the door. His eyes widened, his hands trembled, and in 3 swift strides he was kneeling beside her, shrugging off his coat to wrap it around her exposed shoulders. His jaw was tight, his voice rough with concern. "Are you hurt?" She wanted to say no, to wave it off, but his warmth pressed close. His eyes held hers with such intensity that her pride crumbled. "Only my pride," she whispered, and for the first time in years she felt something more than fear in a man's gaze. She felt seen. Of course Vince arrived too, his laughter like poison. "Well, well," he drawled, "our proper lady ain't so proper after all." The others snickered behind him, eyes crawling over her, and shame threatened to crush her. But Jack rose, stepping between her and their stares, his body a shield. "She fell," he said firmly. "Anyone with sense can see that." His fists clenched at his sides, but he did not strike, not yet. But he did not strike, not yet. Clara, gathering what strength remained, stood tall with Jack's coat tight around her, and met Vince's smirk with a calm, steady voice. "If respect frightens you, Mr. Morgan, perhaps you should wonder why." The words silenced the room, cutting sharper than any blade. Later, alone in the kitchen, her heart still racing, she thought of Jack's hands shaking when he first saw her, of his coat wrapped around her, of the way his voice had steadied in her defense. That night, when he appeared at her door once more, there was no demand in his eyes, only quiet sincerity. "Everyone deserves a fresh start," he said again, softer this time, as though the words were not only for her, but for himself too. And when he left her there, clutching his coat like a fragile shield, she felt something new rise in her chest. Not just survival, not just stubbornness, but hope. The days blurred together after that, but beneath the routine of bread and coffee, of laughter and work songs, a fragile thread was weaving itself between them. Clara felt it in the way Jack's gaze lingered when he thought she wasn't watching, in the way he carried her burdens without asking, in the way he gave without expecting anything in return. She'd spent so long believing men only took, only demanded, that this quiet kindness unsettled her. It was like water to parched soil, a healing balm to wounds she thought would never close. And yet, shadows stirred. Vince's whispers grew sharper, his eyes more venomous. Clara knew he would not stop until he'd broken her spirit. But she also knew she wasn't the same frightened girl who had fled Cheyenne. Not anymore. With Jack near, with her own strength returning, she was ready to fight. What she didn't yet realize was that Jack carried his own ghosts. Ghosts that bound him to her in ways neither of them dared admit. Ghosts that bound him to her in ways neither of them dared admit. And soon those shadows would rise, forcing both of them to face truths long buried beneath the dust of the frontier. The afternoon sun slanted low across the plains, bathing the ranch in molten light, when Clara found herself once more in the pantry, sleeves rolled, determination set like stone. The ranch lived on bread, flour its lifeblood, and she refused to let scarcity defeat her. She balanced precariously on a chair, then a crate stacked on top, stretching for the heavy sack at the highest shelf. Her skirts tangled about her legs, her body straining upward. For a brief heartbeat she believed she could do it, that her stubborn will might bend the world her way. Then wood shifted beneath her feet. A sudden crack, a violent lurch. The world tilted and collapsed. She fell with a cry, sack of flour exploding across her like ghostly snow, her breath ripped from her chest, her dress snagging and tearing open with a sound that seemed to echo far louder than it should. She lay stunned, dust spiraling in the air, white powder clinging to her hair, her lashes, her skin. The rip in her dress exposed the thin cotton of her shift beneath, more skin than she had ever meant to show. Horror choked her. She scrambled to gather the torn fabric against her chest, her face aflame with humiliation. And then footsteps thundered, a shadow filled the doorway, and she froze. Jack Roosevelt stood there, his grey eyes widening in shock at the sight before him. Clara crumpled on the ground, flower blooming around her like some tragic angel, her dress torn open. For one long moment neither moved, as if the air itself held them hostage. Then his hands shook, his breath hitched, and with 3 swift strides he was beside her, shrugging off his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. He could not meet her eyes. His jaw was locked tight, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if to protect her dignity with the only weapon he had. His restraint. Protect her dignity with the only weapon he had. His restraint. "Are you hurt?" His voice rasped low, rough, trembling at the edges. Clara swallowed hard, clutching the coat close. "My pride, mostly." The words cracked, but she forced them out. "And a week's worth of flour." Jack lifted his gaze at last, and what she found there was not hunger or cruelty, but something deeper, haunted and protective all at once. "Flour can be replaced," he murmured. He reached to help her rise, his touch brief, careful, reverent. When she stumbled, her ankle giving a sharp throb of pain, he steadied her without hesitation, his hand warm through the thick cloth of his coat. For a heartbeat, she allowed herself to lean against him, just enough to feel the strength of him, the steadiness that she had craved for so long. But before she could speak, before that fragile peace could settle, another voice slashed through the air. Vince Morgan. "Well, well," Vince drawled, leaning in the doorway with his cruel smile. "Well," Vince drawled, leaning in the doorway with his cruel smile. "Looks like our proper lady ain't so proper after all. Dress didn't tear itself now, did it?" His laughter was joined by Benjamin and Grover, young cowhands eager for his approval. Their eyes roved over Clara, sharp as knives, and she felt shame burn through her veins. Jack stepped forward instantly, his broad frame shielding her from their gaze. She fell, reaching for supplies. Anyone with eyes can see that. His tone was steel, but Vince only smirked wider. "Oh, I see plenty. A woman who knows how to get a man's attention. Bet you pulled the same tricks back in whatever saloon spat you out. The room seemed to freeze. Clara felt Jack go rigid, fury radiating from him like heat from a forge. "Watch your mouth," he growled, low and dangerous. Vince tilted his head, mockery dripping from every syllable. "Or what? You'll defend her honor? What honor?" The sneer twisted his face ugly. The sneer twisted his face ugly. "She's got none to defend." Clara's throat tightened, but then something inside her snapped. She stepped from behind Jack, shoulders square, chin high, flower still clinging to her hair like pale crown. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, steady, sharper than any blade. "You're right, Mr. Morgan. You have seen my type before. The type who works honest for her wages, who cooks your meals, who mends your shirts, who asks only respect in return. If that threatens you, perhaps you should ask yourself why." A hush fell. Vince's face flushed red, his sneer faltering beneath the calm fire in her gaze. Before he could lash back, another voice cut through. The foreman, Samuel Morse, his words cracking like a gunshot. "That's enough. Morgan, Harrison, Cleveland. Back to work." The men slunk away, Vince tossing one last poisonous look over his shoulder. Morse's eyes landed on Clara, then on Jack. "Get yourself cleaned up, Miss Edison. Supper's in 2 hours." And to Jack, "Roosevelt, or we need to talk." When they were gone, Clara sank onto a stool, trembling, Jack's coat heavy around her shoulders. The scent of him, cedar, sage, faint smoke, wrapped her tighter than the fabric. Her humiliation burned still, but beneath it something unexpected had taken root. She had faced them. She had not crumbled. And Jack had stood by her, unflinching. That night, whispers followed her through the ranch. Eyes weighed her down with speculation, but when she caught sight of Jack across the yard, his gaze steady, she felt something unbreakable between them. Later, when the kitchen was quiet and shadows lay thick, Jack returned. His lip was tight from Morse's reprimand, but his eyes softened when they met hers. "Morse says I owe you an apology," he murmured. "You don't," Clara replied, voice low over the clatter of dishwater. "I fell. You helped. That's all." He stepped closer, not too close, but enough that the air seemed to change. What Vince said, it was inevitable. "But it isn't true." Clara's hands stilled, water dripping from her fingers. Men like him always find something to say about women like me." Jack's voice cracked when he answered. "You're not." He stopped, searching for words. "You don't owe anyone explanations. Not to him, not to me, not to anyone." Silence stretched. Clara turned, her eyes locking with his. "Then why," she whispered, "do I feel as though I'm still waiting to give one?" Jack's face shifted, shadows crossing it like storm clouds. "Because I once knew a girl," he confessed quietly. "Back in Kansas. Honest girl. People tore her apart with gossip, and I stood by. I didn't defend her. Told myself it wasn't my business." His fists clenched, regret etched deep in his features. "I should have done something. I didn't. I've carried it ever since." Clara's heart stumbled. She understood suddenly the weight in his eyes, the tremor in his hands when he'd seen her fall. She whispered, "What happened to her?" His gaze met hers, haunted. "West, looking for a new start?" I don't know where. And then she saw it. The recognition, the memory threading between them. His grey eyes had seen her once before, long ago, in another town, under another name. The truth hovered, unspoken but undeniable. The kitchen felt too small, the air too heavy with the past pressing between them. Clara turned back to her dishes, her voice unsteady. We all have things we should have done differently. A long silence, then his voice, softer. Jack. Just Jack. She whispered it, tasting it on her tongue like something solid, something real. Thank you, she added, for the coat, for standing up when you didn't have to. He hesitated, then nodded once. Tomorrow some of us ride into town. Supplies. You need fabric for a new dress. Come with us. His words were steady, but beneath them something deeper pulsed. Purely business, he added. But the warmth in his eyes betrayed him. When he left, the kitchen felt emptier, but Clara's heart was not the same. She leaned against the counter, clutching his coat close. The past was stirring, secrets clawing at the edges of her fragile new life, but for the first time she dared to believe she might not have to face them alone. Tomorrow's ride would change everything. She knew it as surely as she knew the rhythm of her own breath. And as the wind howled across the plains, she whispered a quiet prayer for strength, unaware that Jack Roosevelt carried a prayer of his own. Both were about to collide in ways neither could foresee, their lives weaving tighter with each passing hour, healing and dangerous all at once. The dawn broke clear and sharp, the Montana sky stretching vast and endless above the wagon road. Clara climbed up beside Jack, the wood of the seat rough beneath her palms, her bundle of fabric money tucked deep in her pocket. Purely business, she reminded herself, though the warmth of his hand steadying her as she settled beside him sent a strange calm through her veins. Horses snorted, breath steaming in the cold air, and the wagon jolted forward. The land rolled wide before them, valleys golden with autumn grass, mountains distant and solemn, their peaks painted with early snow. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, though it was not the chill alone that made her tremble. The ride was long, 3 hours of creaking wheels and the rhythm of hooves. At first they spoke little, both careful, both bound by the weight of things unspoken. But as the miles slipped by, words began to spill. Jack told her of Kansas, his father's rigid expectations, the fight that had driven him away, the years of cattle drives that had carved both muscle and loneliness into his frame. Clara listened, her eyes fixed on the horizon, and then she shared pieces of her own story, pieces she rarely gave away. Illinois, parents buried too soon, an aunt who hadn't wanted her, the endless search for work that left scars on her spirit. Jack's hands tightened on the reins, his grey eyes shadowed with a grief she knew was for her as much as for himself. When the town appeared around a bend, it felt almost foreign. A cluster of false-fronted stores, a saloon with the faint sound of a piano drifting out, the bustle of wagons and voices. Jack pulled up in front of the general store, leapt down with easy grace, and offered her his hand. For a moment she hesitated. Then she placed her hand in his, and the contact sparked something warm, steadying. Inside, bolts of cotton and wool lined the walls. Clara ran her fingers across them, letting the textures anchor her. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Grant, studied her patched dress with cool eyes, but Clara stood tall. "I may work in a kitchen," she said evenly, "but I haven't given up on beauty." She chose blue wool instead of brown, her gaze daring the older woman to judge. Slowly, Mrs. Grant's expression softened, as if she had glimpsed the quiet defiance of a woman who refused to bow. When Clara stepped outside, fabric tucked under her arm, Jack was waiting with sacks of grain loaded in the wagon, but instead of turning back, he guided the horses toward the small cafe at the edge of town. "You should eat a meal you didn't have to cook," he said, jaw set in that stubborn line she had already begun to recognize. "Jack," she whispered, "people are already talking." His reply was simple. "Then let them. Some things are worth talking about." Inside, the cafe was nearly empty. Jack pulled out a chair for her, his hands gentle yet firm, his movements full of respect. Clara sat stiffly at first, her pulse racing. But then the waitress came, a girl not much younger than herself, eyes kind, tone free of judgment. They ordered stew and coffee, and as the minutes slipped by, Clara's defenses slowly melted. Jack didn't demand stories, didn't press her with questions. He simply listened when she spoke, noticed when her coffee cup ran low, filled the silence with presence rather than pressure. It was a healing she had not known she needed, the healing of being treated not as a shadow of gossip, but as a woman who mattered. But the fragile peace shattered at the post office. Vince Morgan was there, his grin sharp as ever, his voice a blade. "Well, well, Roosevelt, treating the kitchen girl like a lady." He tipped his hat mockingly at Clara. "Clara, that's your name, isn't it? Or did you go by something else back in Cheyenne?" The blood drained from her face. The floor swayed beneath her. Jack's body went taut beside her, but Clara forced steel into her voice. "I've been many places, Mr. Morgan, working honestly wherever I could." Vince's eyes glittered with malice. "Honestly? Sure. Though a friend of mine swears he saw a girl at the Rosebud Saloon who looked just like you, went by another name, served drinks with a smile until the cowboys grew tired of her act." The words struck like whips. Clara's breath came ragged, shame surging through her veins. She turned away, but Jack's hand gripped the reins tightly as they rode back in silence. The landscape blurred past, but she felt only the weight of her past clawing its way into the present. At last, Jack halted the wagon short of the ranch, his face hard, eyes fierce. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice steady with conviction. "Whatever happened in Cheyenne, it doesn't matter to me." Clara laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. "It will." Sound hollow. "It will. When Vince spreads his poison, when the men start looking at me differently, when Morse decides I'm too much trouble, it will matter then." Jack turned to face her fully, his grey eyes raw with truth. "I was there." The world seemed to stop. Clara stared at him, her throat dry. "You saw?" He nodded, the reins slipping loose in his hands. "I saw you at the Rosebud. Saw those men corner you. Saw you fight them off. And I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my business, but I've regretted it every day since." His voice broke, and she saw the pain etched deep, the weight of guilt he had carried all these years. Her heart twisted. He had seen her lowest moment, the night she had fled into darkness with nothing but shame clinging to her skin. And yet here he was, not condemning, not mocking, but confessing his own failure. Slowly, she breathed, steadying herself. "We've all done things we regret," she whispered. The question is what we do next. Jack's jaw tightened, resolve settling like armor. What we do next is go back to that ranch and face it, together, if you'll let me. Clara stared at him, at the man who had carried guilt like a wound, who had still chosen to defend her when others spat on her name, who had offered blankets and coats and quiet kindness when she had nothing left. The thought of running tugged at her, the familiar instinct to disappear, to start over again somewhere new. But she was tired of running, tired of fear, and as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in fire, she whispered, "All right, together." They rode back as shadows lengthened, ranch lights flickering against the darkening sky. Ahead, she saw men gathered on the porch, Vince among them, his voice carrying, laughter cruel and knowing. The battle was only beginning. Yet for the first time in years, Clara did not feel alone. Yet for the first time in years, Clara did not feel alone. Jack's hand lingered near hers on the reins, not touching, not yet, but steady as the ground beneath her. She squared her shoulders, stepping down from the wagon as the whispers grew louder. Supper awaited, judgment awaited, but so did something else, something she had not dared believe in for years: hope. And as she walked toward the kitchen door, Jack's words echoed in her ears. "Whatever happens, you're not alone this time." The truth of it wrapped around her like a shield. The fight ahead would be hard, but her heart was no longer hollow. With each step, she moved not only toward the kitchen fire, but toward a future that was finally beginning to reveal itself, a future carved from pain, yet softened with the promise of healing. By evening, the sky had settled into a bruised violet, and lanterns glowed along the eaves like small, stubborn stars. Clara ladled stew with steady hands, while the bunkhouse buzzed with the uneasy current of things unsaid. Word had moved faster than smoke. Laughter stumbled and fell whenever she passed, and the air felt as thin as high country breath. Old Theodore Sherman cracked a joke about beans that didn't land. William McKinley scraped his chair back too carefully, as if noise itself might break the room. Chester Arthur stared into his tin cup as though it held a clearer truth than any of them dared to speak. Vince wasn't there. That absence was its own noise. Jack arrived late, sundust on his shoulders, and the stern set of a man working hard to keep his temper sheathed. He took the end seat, the one that made it easy to see the door, the stove, and Clara all at once. When she came with a fresh pot of coffee, he reached out as if to relieve her of it, then let his hand fall, some unspoken discipline returning to its post. She poured. He nodded. A quiet exchange, but in it was the steadiness she'd been living on, the healing warmth of being recognized without being claimed. When the bowls were empty and the flatware stilled, Clara set the ladle down. Silence puckered. She wiped her hands on her apron and lifted her chin. She could feel her heart beating in her wrists. "I have something to say." The room tightened. "Mr. Morgan has been telling stories," she began, voice even, not brittle. "Some of you have heard them. Some of you will hear them tomorrow." She let her gaze travel the table. The weathered kindness of Theodore, the boyish bravado of Benjamin and Grover, the guarded watchfulness of those still deciding who she was allowed to be. "I won't hide from the truth you deserve to know." The stove ticked softly. A horse snorted outside. In the hush, even breath sounded like thunder. "My name is Clara Edison," I was born in Illinois to good people and buried them too soon. I have worked since I was 15. Hotels, boarding houses, kitchens. I worked at the Rosebud Saloon in Cheyenne. I served drinks. I kept my hands and my honor clean. That didn't stop some men from trying to take what wasn't theirs. One night they cornered me. I fought. The owner called me trouble and threw me out because trouble scares men who count coins. I left with nothing but a suitcase and the pieces of my dignity I could carry. She paused, not for effect, for breath, for courage to settle its feet again. I am not asking for your pity, she continued softly. I am asking for the decency you'd want for your sisters, your mothers, your daughters. I cook your meals. I mend your shirts. I treat your burns and frostbite and headaches as if you were family, because sometimes kindness is the only medicine a body can afford out here. I'll keep doing that work with a clear heart. If that makes me unfit for some man's idea of a saint, so be it. The words lay on the table like freshly hammered nails, plain, necessary, unbending. For a long stretch, no one moved. Then Theodore cleared his throat, old eyes bright. "Takes guts to stand in a room full of cattlemen and call us to our better selves," he said, voice roughened by wind and years. "You've had mine since the flapjack that didn't taste like axle grease. Now you've got more." William lifted his cup. "To work and to character," he said simply. A few men followed, tin cups rising like a small, stubborn chorus. But not all. A knot of younger hands shifted, uncomfortable, as if she had turned the lamp up too bright on the stories they preferred. Chester spoke without looking up. "A saloon girl is a saloon girl," he muttered, the old judgment crouched in his mouth. "And a man who decides a person's worth by the worst rumor he heard is a smaller man than his boots," Jack said, quiet as snowfall and twice as cold. The line of his jaw was iron. He didn't look away from Chester, but his voice came out for the room. "We work in a place where storms take cattle, where fire eats barns, and a winter wind will strip the pride off your bones. Will strip the pride off your bones. Out here we can't afford to be cheap with mercy." Clara did not look at Jack. She let the heat of that defense move through her like coffee on a freezing morning. And then she did what she promised. She went back to work. Platter after platter, she set supper down in front of men who would talk about her in their bunks as the lanterns burned low. She fed them anyway. It was something like grace. After, she scrubbed pots until the water clouded and her aching arms went pleasantly numb. The kitchen was her chapel. The slow rhythm of the pump, the neat stack of drying plates, the fragrance of bread, cooling like a prayer someone had finally remembered to say. When the back door creaked, she didn't start. She knew the weight of his step. "I wanted to say," Jack began, then stopped, the words running hard against the dam of his restraint. "You don't have to," she said without turning. She could hear it in the rise and fall of his breath, the battle he fought to keep whatever burned in him from becoming more trouble for her. "You stood for me at the table. That's plenty." Boot leather whispered across the boards. He didn't come closer. "You stood for yourself," he said. "That's what matters." She set the last pot to dry and finally faced him. He looked like he always did at the end of a long day, dust in the seams of his coat, hands nicked and raw, eyes that held more weather than the sky. "Morse is right," she said. This ranch isn't a court of law, it's a place of work. So we'll work, and we'll let the days speak for us." His mouth tilted. Pride, grief, something warm and a little awed. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll fix the shelf you fell from, and the window that sticks, and the latch the wind keeps teasing." A beat. "And if there's more you'd have me do, say it." "Tomorrow," she agreed, and the word felt like a gift they had both unwrapped. He left her to her quiet. She stepped out into the night, where the cold was honest and the stars were so near she could have threaded them. The mountains were dark shoulders against the sky. Out there, the world didn't care about gossip. It cared about whether you kept going. In the days that followed, the ranch learned her truth the way it learns the shape of a riverbank. Slowly, then all at once. Some men softened, their jokes gentled at the edges, their gratitude a shade less guarded. A few stiffened, revealing the narrowness she had expected all along. The women in town, that watchful jury, split too. Mrs. Grant at the store boxed her thread without comment, but wrapped it neat, her fingers careful. Mary Lycan, the foreman's wife, came by unannounced with a jar of plum preserves and a flinty look that said the preserves weren't charity. They were recognition. "You've got a backbone," Mary said, setting the jar down like a statement. "That's rare and useful out here." Useful became a kind of blessing. Clara leaned into it. She coaxed a healing garden from the hard ground behind the kitchen. Yarrow for bleeding, willow for pain, plantain for bites and stings. She boiled spruce tips into a syrup that soothed coughs and sweetened coffee on days the sugar barrel ran light. She wrote careful lists on brown paper. Supplies to stretch the winter, roots that kept her away from men who took too much liberty with a cornered woman. She mended a dozen jackets, patched 24 pairs of trousers, and on a night when ice knifed the wind, she left a loaf and a jar of salve on the bunkhouse step with no note. The next morning, someone had left a packet of nails on the kitchen sill, and later that week her stovepipe drew better because, somehow, the rooftop had been neatly reseated. Narrow men stayed narrow. That was a weather forecast she couldn't change. But she began to see something else. How generosity travels like warmth through cold walls. How respect grows where you pour the daily water of competence and care. Her own breath smoothed out. The tremor in her hands that used to come at dusk eased. Sometimes, when she lay down in the small room, smell of soap and flour and cedar, she felt peace touch her shoulder with a mother's hand. Vince returned to bother the peace because that is what small men do. He came in on whiskey feet one Wednesday, eyes shiny, mouth cruel, and the room you could have cut with a knife. He backed her toward the counter, words slick and ugly, reaching because that was the only language he trusted. Jack arrived between one heartbeat and the next, and the table went over with the speed of what followed. Fists, a chair, the brief music of men forced to behave by stronger men who have had enough. Morse shouldered in, judgment clean and quick. "Morgan, you're off this ranch at first light." Vince's laughter was all teeth, but fear showed under the gums. He went anyway, slanting a last promise of trouble over his shoulder. When the door shut, chaos swirled and thinned, like creek mud settling back to clarity. "Are you hurt?" Jack asked, not touching, not crowding. "No," she said, the truth filling her lungs like a strong breath. "Not anymore." That night, the bunkhouse argued at a low roar. Clara could hear it as she scrubbed the last pan, the rise and fall, the old habits grappling with the new story she had placed in the middle of the floor. Men are slow to change until something dear to them hurts under the strain. It takes time for kind of knowing to sink in, not a single moment, but sediment laid down by a river that keeps returning to the same bank. She asked Morse if she might address the men again, formally this time, with all the rough dignity the place allowed. He weighed her with the even gaze he used on sky and cattle. "You sure?" he asked. "I am." After supper the next day, with the lanterns making small suns out of ordinary light, Clara stood at the head of the room. It was easier now that she had chosen not to be hidden. "You know what happened," she said. "You were in the room. You can believe what you want. I'll keep doing my work. But here's what I won't do. I won't be cornered. I won't be spoken to like less than a full human being. The next man who forgets that gets a skillet to remind him." A ripple of laughter, nervous, then real. Andrew Carnegie, sweet, keen-eyed boy, grinned like dawn. Even Chester's mouth softened against his will. It was enough. After the dishes, after the pump, and the stack of plates, and the breadcloth, laid careful as a blessing over tomorrow's loaves, she stepped outside to cool air and a sky that had laid its silver out like a tablecloth. The long day rested in her bones in a way that felt like being held. The back steps creaked. Jack lowered himself beside her, keeping that respectful inch between them, and also somehow closing every mile. "What does it feel like?" he asked after a time. "To speak what you thought would drown you," she said, surprised to hear her voice steady. "Like pulling a thorn. It stung and bled, but I can breathe deeper." He nodded, gaze on the stars. "I wanted to fix it," he admitted. "With my hands, with a punch, with a fence you could live behind, but I think the mending you needed most was your own voice." She let that settle, its truth both tender and sharp. "And what of yours?" she asked. "What mending do you need?" He was quiet for so long she nearly took the question back out of mercy. Then, "I need to stop paying my debt to you by hurting other men," he said slowly, as if he were feeling his way across stones in a dark creek. "And start paying it by being what you deserve, steady, honest, not afraid of being seen standing where I choose to stand." The night breathed around them. A fox barked from the far cottonwoods. A meadowlark stitched one last thread of song into the gathering dark. Clara didn't say thank you. She didn't know how to fold gratitude that large into a single word. She let her shoulder rest against the doorframe, and the quiet between them took on the warmth of a newly banked fire. Days found their rhythm again. Men worked, weather shifted. The ledger of kindness and consequence continued its slow arithmetic. One morning, a wind rose out of the north with teeth. It hissed through chinks and plucked the eave string like a fiddle. The air got that strange, restless taste Clara would later recognize as the mouth of a storm. By afternoon, the mountains had shouldered on a dark cloak, and lightning stitched the horizon with careless brilliance. They were preparing supper when Andrew ran in wild-eyed. "Fire!" he gasped. "North pasture, lightning struck. It's running fast." Everything that mattered moved at once. Morse's voice cut through the yard, calm and commanding, calling men to a line, to buckets, to shovels, to the old knowledge of how you fight flame on open ground. Jack threw her a look that said, "Stay," and a look that said, I know you won't." And then he was gone, already swallowed by the fury of it. Clara hauled every pot she owned to the pump, to the well, to the barrel catching rain that had not yet begun. She soaked cloths, lined them in a basket, sent Andrew to the porch with water and the iron will of a boy who wanted to be a man. Heat rolled like an animal. Smoke smeared the sky so low the wild geese might have mistaken it for land. Clara's lungs burned as she ran, swaddled heads and forearms in wet fabric, pushed coffee into trembling hands, bound a palm blistered by a shovel handle, forced a man bent double by cough to sit, breathe, sip. The fire's roar was its own weather, a moving continent of sound. She caught glimpses. Jack hauling a lathered mare from the barn and shoving her toward clean air. Theodore cussing the heavens as he stamped out the creeping edges of a tongue of flame. Morse, every inch the captain of a ship in a black sea, setting men to cut a line where the grass could be persuaded to give way. The sky split. A gust came with it, turning the fire wicked. It leapt a swale, snagged a corner of roof. Someone screamed that Andrew was on the loft. Clara felt her stomach fall out of her. Jack didn't hesitate. He vanished into the dark door, and for a blink the world lost its edges. She didn't pray for a miracle. She prayed for steadiness, for breath, for the next right thing. When Jack came out, he had Andrew cradled like a younger brother, both of them black with smoke, both alive. The barn groaned and folded like a tired animal. Rain arrived at last, late and repentant, and what they had fought with shovels and human stubbornness, the sky finished. By dawn they were a ragged congregation, singed, ash-faced, whole. The barn was half a broken tooth against the new light, but the house stood, the horses stood, the men stood, and Clara, exhausted to the bone, stood and kept standing. She'd tied a wet handkerchief around Jack's split knuckles and found his eyes looking at her like a man who had nearly lost more than a building. "Don't," she said, because speech had become as spare as the rest of her. "Don't apologize. Don't promise me anything you can't control. Just—" She put a hand to his chest, where the hammer of his heart checked in like a messenger arriving breathless with good news. "Just keep coming home." He closed his hand around her wrist, careful, reverent. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the joke hit them both like medicine. Small, bitter-sweet, necessary. The ranch breathed out a long, shaky breath. Men slumped on stoops. Someone laughed too loudly and then coughed. And then everyone laughed because they were allowed to now. The rain kept on with the quiet insistence of scolding that turns to comfort. Clara refilled cups and passed bread and felt a tired joy take seed in the charred edges of what they had survived. She slept hard that afternoon, the kind of sleep that repairs the scaffolding of a person. When she woke, the light had gone tender and low, and the place smelled of wet earth, smoke, and a second chance. Outside, men were already sorting salvage, measuring what could be rebuilt. Work, a catechism they all knew. Clara tied her apron and returned to the kitchen. She set dough to rise, folded salve into jars, wrote a neat list of what they lacked now. Nails, shingles, feed, fabric. At the bottom, she added a word she almost didn't recognize in her own hand. Together. Night fell soft that day, as if the sky had decided not to test them again just yet. Jack found her on the steps, the air cool. The stars returned to their posts. He lowered himself beside her, shoulders brushing this time because the distance had been burned thinner by what they'd walked through. "You were the strongest person in Montana today," he said matter-of-factly, no flourish, as if he'd just accounted cattle and found her the exact number of courage they'd needed. "I was the one with the water," she answered, "and the will to stay." They sat without speaking a while, the kind of quiet that stitches torn hours back into a whole day. In the east, a low glimmer promised another change in the weather. The fire had taken and the rain had given. Now the wind turned, and with it the season itself, shouldering into something harder. When Jack stood, he offered her his hand, a habit that had become a promise. She took it, let him draw her to her feet. There would be more trouble. There are always more trials in a country that insists on its own beauty even when it bites. But the heart learns its way back to steady, like a horse learns the path to water. The storm that would come next would not burn, it would freeze. And when it did, the same stubborn love would be there to warm the edges, to hold the line, to say again and again, without ceremony and with every small act, "We endure, we mend, we choose each other." The first frost of October painted the ranch silver, crisp air sharp enough to sting the lungs, yet strangely invigorating, as if the world itself had been scoured clean overnight. Clara rose before dawn, striking the flint until sparks bloomed and the fire caught, filling the kitchen with the fragrance of wood smoke. Coffee hissed on the stove, bread dough shaped beneath her palms, steady work calming her spirit. Healing lived in these small rituals, the warmth of a rising loaf, the simple blessing of hot water for washing, the rhythm of life that refused to surrender to storm or rumor. She had survived fire, survived judgment, and though whispers still followed, she stood taller each morning, stitched together by quiet courage. When the men filed in for breakfast, some offered their usual jokes, some kept to silence, but Clara met them all with steady grace. She noticed the little things, William's limp from a fall in the pasture, Theodore's cough returning with the cold, Andrew's eagerness to please as he carried wood. She gave them extra bread, extra honey, soft words that stitched invisible threads of family. What mattered was not their opinion of her past, but how they lived together in this fragile present. Jack entered last, his shoulders broad against the doorframe, the dawn light making silver of the stubble on his jaw. He had been up all night, riding the northern fence line after word of strays. His eyes found hers with the same quiet certainty that had steadied her since the first evening he brought blankets. Clara placed a steaming mug in his hand, and he accepted it with a look that was thanks enough. He said nothing, yet the silence between them felt like a promise. The days hardened as autumn deepened. Work never ceased. Cattle had to be driven toward shelter, wood stacked, roofs checked for leaks. Clara threw herself into labor with the same determination that had carried her across miles of prairie. She dried herbs for winter, stitched blankets, taught Andrew letters at the kitchen table in the lamplight. And through it all, Jack's presence lingered like a steadying current, sometimes in the way he lifted a heavy barrel without being asked, sometimes in the way he lingered just long enough at the doorway to be sure she was safe. But shadows lengthened too. Vince's poison had not died with his departure. In town, she felt eyes follow her, voices hush when she passed. Once, while buying lamp oil, 2 women whispered loudly enough for her to hear, "Saloon girls don't turn respectable, no matter how many biscuits they bake." Clara lifted her chin, paid for her oil, and left without answering. Still, the words clung like burrs, scratching at her resolve. That Saturday, as promised, Jack took her into town again. The wagon rolled slow over frozen ruts, the sky pale and hard above them. Clara's hands tightened on her shawl, nerves pulling at her despite herself. Clara's hands tightened on her shawl, nerves pulling at her despite herself. She feared more whispers, more pointed stares, feared the familiar tightening in her chest that had chased her from town to town. But Jack sat steady beside her, one hand light on the reins, his presence grounding her. Purely business, he had said before, but when she glanced sideways, she saw warmth beneath his calm, and for a moment she let herself breathe easier. Inside the general store, Clara chose sturdy blue wool for a new dress. Mrs. Grant, the shopkeeper's wife, watched her with the same cool eyes as before. Clara braced for judgment, but instead the woman said quietly, "Blue will suit you. Strong, but not showy." Something shifted in her tone, a flicker of reluctant respect. Clara nodded, her voice even. "Thank you." Small victories mattered. When they left, Jack surprised her again by steering the wagon not toward home, but to the small cafe at the edge of town. "You deserve to eat a meal you didn't have to cook," he said simply. And though her heart beat quick with fear of gossip, she found herself seated across from him in a windowed booth, steam rising from bowls of stew. The waitress was young and kind-eyed, and Clara realized with a rush of warmth that not every gaze carried cruelty. She ate, almost timidly at first, then with the joy of a woman remembering what it felt like to be cared for. Jack said little, but when their eyes met, she felt as though whole chapters of unsaid things passed quietly between them. It should have been a day of healing, yet as it always did. At the post office, Vince appeared again, hat tipped low, smile sharp as broken glass. He greeted them with mockery, twisting her name into a weapon, hinting at Cheyenne, hinting at truths too raw to bear. Clara's blood turned to ice, and silence closed around her. Jack's jaw hardened, but even his defense could not erase the sting. The ride home was quiet, their easy camaraderie shattered. At last, short of the ranch, Jack stopped the wagon and turned to her. "I was there," he said, voice heavy with confession. Clara's breath caught as he spoke of the night at the Rosebud, how he had watched and done nothing. He carried his guilt like a stone, and in his eyes she saw the weight of all the years between. Her heart ached, not just from shame, but from the honesty laid bare. "We've all done things we regret," she whispered. "The question is, what we do next." Jack's reply was firm, his gaze unwavering. "What we do next is face it, together, if you'll let me." For a long moment, Clara considered the old, familiar escape. Running had always been easier, safer. But as the mountains caught fire with sunset, she realized she was tired of running. "All right," she said softly, "together." That night, whispers grew sharper. Vince sowed doubt-like seed across the ranch, and Clara felt the sting of eyes judging her, measuring her against shadows of rumor. Yet at supper she held her head high, serving each plate with dignity. Afterward, she asked Morse for permission to speak. With lanterns glowing against wood walls, she stood before them all and told the truth, every piece of it. Her voice carried steady, her spine straight, her pride no longer hidden. She named the rosebud, named the injustice, named the survival. "I am not ashamed of honest work," she declared. "I am ashamed only of a world that judges a woman by gossip instead of her actions." Silence followed, then the old voice of Theodore Sherman. "Takes courage to stand like that, miss. More than most men I know." His respect rippled outward, loosening other voices, easing the weight. Not all accepted her, but enough did. And for the first time, Clara felt the chains of silence break. Later, on the back steps, the stars scattered silver above them. Jack joined her, settling beside her in the cool air. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said, and when she laughed softly, he added, "Or the stupidest, maybe both." His gaze lingered, steady and unflinching. "How do you feel?" She let the night air fill her lungs, clean and crisp. "Free," she said, surprised at the truth of it. He turned to her fully, words rough but tender. "You're not fallen. You're the strongest person I know. You survived what would break most. That's not fallen. That's risen." Her breath caught, her chest aching with a warmth she had long forgotten. Jack reached, cupped her face gently, reverently, as if she were something precious. "This isn't about making up for the past. This is about the future. I can't go a day without thinking of you. Clara Edison, do I have a chance?" For once, she did not think of gossip or shame or the long road of survival. She thought only of the way he had stood for her, the way he had seen her. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, you do." Their kiss was gentle, soft as snowfall, yet full of the promise of healing. When they pulled apart, breath mingled, and Jack pressed his forehead to hers. "We'll face whatever comes," he said. Clara closed her eyes, the truth of it wrapping her in warmth. "Together," she agreed. The stars wheeled high, and though winter winds prowled beyond the hills, Clara felt no fear. At last, she had found not just a place, but a partner, not just survival, but love. Fierce, steady, healing love that promised to endure through storm and fire alike. And as the night deepened, she knew the next trials would come soon, but she would not face them alone. The first snow arrived before the ground had finished drinking the rain from autumn storms, a white veil sweeping low across the plains, as if the land itself had turned a page. As if the land itself had turned a page. The cold came with a vengeance, fierce enough to crack wood and sting breath, and every man at the ranch knew it meant a fight for survival. Cattle bawled in the distance, their breath misting into ghosts. Clara stood at the kitchen window, hands tight around a mug of coffee, watching Jack move through the storm with a surety that steadied her even as fear curled sharp inside her ribs. The men were gathering ropes, lanterns, and blankets. Word had come quick. 500 heads stranded in the north pasture, the blizzard swallowing sight and sound. Samuel Morse barked orders, his voice hoarse against the wind. Jack pulled on his coat, snow already clinging to his hair, and stepped into the kitchen long enough to grab food and spare gloves. Clara was waiting, shawl around her shoulders, basket packed with jars of salve, cloths, bread, and coffee. "You're not coming," Jack said immediately, shaking snow from his hat. His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed his worry. His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed his worry. Clara set the basket down with quiet certainty. "I am. They'll need hot food, water, someone who knows how to tend frostbite. You know as well as I do the storm will not wait for mercy." Their eyes held, a clash of fear and determination. Finally, Jack exhaled, the fight leaving his shoulders. He brushed his thumb over her knuckles in a fleeting gesture, more confession than touch. "Stay close to me. If we get separated in this, the storm will eat us both." They rode out together, swallowed by a wall of white. Snow struck like needles against their cheeks. Wind howled like some wild thing bent on tearing flesh from bone. Clara clung to the wagon as Jack guided them through the drifts, his posture steady. Clara clung to the wheel against panic. Hours blurred. Distance became meaningless. Shapes loomed and vanished in the storm, men shouting to one another only to have their voices carried away by the blizzard's fury. Loomed and vanished in the storm, men shouting to one another only to have their voices carried away by the blizzard's fury. By the time they reached the pasture, the cattle were half frozen, huddled together, eyes rolling wild. Men struggled to drive them toward the valley, fighting the drag of snow that threatened to bury beast and rider alike. Clara built a fire against the lee of rocks, coaxing flame to life with numb fingers until it roared stubborn against the storm. She melted snow in iron pots, brewed coffee so strong it bit the tongue, fed men with trembling hands. She pressed warm cloths against frost-bitten skin, scolded them into sitting when exhaustion threatened to collapse them into the snow. The hours dragged mercilessly, but still they fought. And then came the shout that shattered what little rhythm they had. Andrew Carnegie, barely 17, had gone after a few strays and not returned. Clara's heart lurched, fear gripping her throat. Before anyone could speak, Jack was already pulling his scarf tighter, his eyes fierce. "I'll find him." Morse caught his arm. "You can't go alone." Jack shook his head. "I know these hills. If anyone else comes, we'll lose too." He didn't wait for argument. He mounted and disappeared into the storm, swallowed whole by the white fury. Clara worked harder, every motion sharp with fear, her gaze flicking constantly to the snow's edge. Hours crawled by, each one heavier than stone. Men returned with cattle, coughing, limping, faces bitten raw by cold. But no Jack, no Andrew. Clara's fire burned low, and still she fed it, as if flame alone could call them back. At last, through the storm's roar, came a faint shout. Figures staggered into view, Jack carrying Andrew limp across his shoulders. Both were ice-crusted, faces pale as death. Clara's knees buckled, relief and terror colliding as men rushed to help. She took command without thought, her healer's instincts stronger than fear. "Get them inside. Strip off the wet clothes. Slowly. Don't warm them too fast." "Blankets, hot stones, broth." Andrew moaned faintly as colour began to creep back into his skin. Jack, conscious but weak, found Clara's hand even as he shook violently. His lips were cracked, his breath ragged. "Found him in a ravine," he rasped. "Couldn't leave him." Clara pressed her forehead to his, her tears hot against his frozen skin. "You fool," she whispered. "You impossible brave fool." He gave the shadow of a smile, though his eyes glazed with exhaustion. "Had to. Couldn't lose him. Couldn't lose anyone else to the storm." She tended him through the long night, spooning broth into him when he could swallow, pressing warm cloths to blistered hands. He drifted in and out, fevered, murmuring half-formed words that revealed pieces of his soul. Fire that had taken his mother when he was a boy. Guilt carried too long. Fear of failing those who depended on him. Clara listened, held his hand, whispered soft assurances that wove healing into the fractured places inside him. As days passed before the worst of the storm released its hold, Jack lay weak but alive, his recovery slow. Clara never left his side. She read aloud from old books, sang quiet hymns, brushed damp hair from his brow. In those quiet hours, she realized something steady had taken root within her. She was no longer merely surviving. She was building a life alongside someone whose courage was fierce, but whose heart was gentle enough to offer her blankets when she had nothing. One evening, as lamplight cast soft gold across the room, Jack caught her hand. His voice was raw, but steady. "Clara, when I was out there in the white, thinking I might not make it back, all I thought of was you. I haven't told you proper, haven't asked." Her breath caught, her eyes locking with his. "Asked what?" He struggled to sit, wincing, but did not let go of her hand. "I don't have much. A cowboy's wages, a cabin that needs building, a life that's hard and dangerous. But I swear you'll never face it alone again. Clara Edison, will you marry me?" Tears blurred her vision. She pressed his hand to her cheek, her voice breaking with warmth and certainty. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." He smiled then, weary but radiant, and pulled her close, their kiss soft as healing balm, binding two weary souls together with the quiet fierceness of love that had survived fire and storm. The next morning, word spread through the ranch like wildfire. Cowboys offered clumsy congratulations, laughter loud enough to shake the frost from the rafters. Theodore muttered about how long it had taken Jack to find his sense, while Andrew beamed like a younger brother, spared by grace. Even Morse, stern as ever, allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. Clara moved through the kitchen with her head high, heart light, her hands busy with bread and stew, but her soul filled with warmth. She was no longer the girl hiding behind shadows of gossip. She was a woman loved, chosen, cherished, and though the road ahead promised more trials, more storms, more fire, more judgment, she knew the truth that would steady her through it all. Whatever came, they would face it together. Beyond the frosted window, the sky cleared, stars scattering silver across the prairie night. Clara paused, hand pressed to her heart, feeling the life she had never dared dream of unfolding at last. And as Jack's footsteps approached behind her, she smiled, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, her spirit carrying both the scars of her past and the healing promise of a future built on love. Winter settled over Montana with a weight both terrible and beautiful, a vast white silence that pressed down on the land, and yet beneath it held the hidden promise of spring. Clara woke each morning to the stillness of snow draped across the ranch like a quilt, the smoke of chimneys rising soft against the grey sky. Married life was not gilded with leisure. It was stitched from long days of work, of mending, of braving cold winds that could freeze the marrow. Yet, in that rhythm, Clara found a healing she had long prayed for. The constancy of Jack at her side, the small sanctuary of their shared laughter, the warmth of belonging she had thought forever denied to her. The cabin Jack had once promised took shape board by board. She helped where she could, her belly growing round with the life they had made together. At night she sat by the fire, her hands resting on the gentle curve, and whispered lullabies half-remembered from her childhood. Jack worked until his muscles ached, until splinters lined his palms, yet when he came inside, he always bent first to kiss her forehead as though she were the most sacred thing he had ever known. There was tenderness in the way he traced circles on her hand, in the way his eyes softened whenever he watched her stir bread dough or mend shirts. Love had taken the sharp edges of his solitude and turned them to something gentler. The men of the ranch changed too, in ways Clara could not have predicted. Theodore brought her fresh milk when her ankles swelled, his rough humor making her laugh even when exhaustion pressed heavy. Young Andrew, fiercely protective after the storm, made her a cradle with his own hands, the wood polished smooth as river stones. Even Chester, who had once muttered, "A saloon girl is a saloon girl," now tipped his hat when he passed her in the yard, a silent apology folded into the gesture. Respect had taken root, and with it Clara's heart healed further. One evening, as wind howled against the shutters, Jack came in from feeding the cattle, his coat crusted with snow, his eyes alight with a secret joy. "Come outside," he whispered, though the cold bit at their skin. Wrapped in blankets, she followed him. Above, the storm clouds had broken, revealing a sky so clear it seemed carved from crystal, and stars blazed like fire scattered across black velvet, and in the hush of that vastness Jack knelt, not to ask again, but to promise. "Clara," he murmured, his voice rough with reverence, "no matter how many storms find us, no matter how hard the years, I will never leave your side. You are my home." Tears stung her eyes, but they were not of sorrow. She touched his cheek, her voice soft as prayer. "And you are mine." Spring came late, the ground reluctant to release its frost, but when at last the first shoots of green pierced the soil, Clara gave birth to their daughter. The cabin filled with cries, sharp and new, then with laughter and wonder. Jack held the baby as if she were spun of light, his strong hands trembling as tears streaked his weathered face. "Hope," Clara whispered, and the name settled in the air like a blessing. Hope Elizabeth Roosevelt, the child of two weary souls who had once carried only shame and regret, now bound together by grace. The birth was pain and fire, but the healing that followed was sweeter than anything Clara had known. Nursing her daughter in the still of night, she felt a wholeness settle over her like the hush of snow after a storm. The years unfolded like pages written in steady ink. Hope grew among the wildflowers and sage, her laughter carrying across the fields like music. Clara opened her kitchen to more than cowboys. She took in young women arriving in town with nothing but hunger and fear in their eyes. She offered them bread, work, dignity. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she would say, the words soft but unshakable. And each time she remembered the day Jack handed her blankets with no demand, only kindness, the day her life turned toward healing. Not all was easy. Vince returned once with men who carried shadows in their eyes, but this time the ranch stood united. Cowboys formed a wall around Clara, their rifles steady, their loyalty louder than any rumor. Vince left, beaten by truth rather than fists, and never returned again. Clara stood in the aftermath, Jack's hand tight around hers, the men nodding to her with quiet respect. She realized then that she no longer lived as a hunted woman. She was part of something larger, a family made of choice, courage, and faith. Seasons passed. Storms rose and broke. Fires tested. Blizzards threatened. Yet each time Clara and Jack stood together, their bond tempered stronger than steel. Love had not erased the past, but it had rewritten its meaning. The saloon girl whispered about in Cheyenne became the woman known in Cedar Ridge for her bread, her herbs, her unshakable kindness. The woman who had been discarded became the heart of a community. And when Clara walked through town with Hope's hand in hers and Jack's steady stride beside her, she carried herself not as someone ashamed, but as someone risen. One summer evening, the cafe she and Jack had opened together bustled with neighbors and travelers. Clara stood behind the counter, apron dusted with flour, her heart full. Hope, now old enough to serve, carried plates with laughter dancing in her grey eyes. Jack leaned against the doorframe, watching his wife and daughter with the quiet awe of a man who knew he had been blessed beyond measure. Outside, the prairie wind stirred, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of tomorrow. Clara looked around at the faces gathered, friends, family, strangers turned kin. She felt the warmth of healing radiate through every corner of the room, through every smile, every shared loaf, every story told by firelight. Life had not been easy, but it had been worth every trial, every scar. She leaned against Jack, resting her head on his shoulder. "We built this," she whispered, "from nothing but hope." He kissed the top of her hair, his voice quiet and steady. "And it will last as long as love does, forever." The night deepened, but the light inside glowed steady, proof that broken beginnings could grow into beautiful endings. Clara's story was not of shame, but of redemption, not of running, but of standing, not of loneliness, but of love. And as she rocked her daughter to sleep under the vast Montana stars, she knew she had finally found the home she had been searching for all her life. If this story has warmed your heart, if you found a little healing in Clara and Jack's journey, I invite you to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe for more tales woven with love and hope. Your support is the light that keeps stories like this alive, and every word you share helps carry that warmth into the world.